5 years ago, the existence of dungeons was confirmed as they simultaneously appeared in various parts of the earth, bringing with them a large number of monsters. This event was called the Stampede. 5 years later, on Hako Island, there is an underground prison called Chikaho, right outside the gates of Odori Park. Here, our hero passes by one of the warriors and immediately looks around. He asks his friend about the fact that he bumped into someone who he thought was his hero, Karaboshi Haruki, a 27-year-old beginner adventurer. Karaboshi Haruki thinks that there are always many people in Chikaho, but in his opinion, there are even more annoying ones. He is frustrated that he hasn't found anything else that belongs to him. His pockets are empty. It just so happens that Karaboshi Haruki hasn't been popular lately, which has upset the Japanese government. They awarded him the honorary title of adventurer. Being an adventurer is a very dangerous job. They have to descend into the dungeon and fight monsters. Karaboshi Haruki goes to his car and thinks about it. He needs to work harder. He looked at his phone and thought about how people could benefit from the adventure to get a job. He could become the mascot of the company. Then he heard someone happily greet Tatsun, whose blog they were reading. Haruki looked at his phone and frustratingly thought about it. He also ran his own blog, but no one read it. Haruki got into his car and decided to go home. He passed by the neighborhood and thought that this area had been destroyed. But recently Haruki's recovered Karaboshi Haruki opened the garage door, thinking about how tired he was. Then he saw a road leading to an underground prison in his garage. Karaboshi Haruki screamed in surprise because there was a hole there. Then he realized that this was the entrance to the basement. He didn't understand why and how it happened. Karaboshi Haruki screamed about what happened to his pirate ship, which was worth 300,000 yen that he had saved for a long time. But what's more important is how will he survive the winter without having to dig snow with his hands, Haruki wondered. He noticed a sign on the floor, picked it up, and then the sign lit up brightly, and soon it dissolved into Haruki's body. He was surprised by it, thinking that he had a foreign object inside him. Then a console appeared in front of him in the air, and he looked towards the panel in front of him where his name and gender were written. He had 3 skill points, which surprised him to think about. He looked at his own military profile. The military arrived at Karaboshi Haruki's house. They got out of the car and wondered if a call came from this house. In this garage, which was the entrance to the underground prison, someone from the military appeared and asked about the owner of the house. They approached Karaboshi Haruki, who greeted them. The military seems to not notice him and says that they hope it's not too late. They say they could ring the bell. Haruki realizes that he didn't hear it and says that he is here. Karaboshi Haruki appears in front of the surprised military, and they shout where he came from. Karaboshi Haruki thinks that yes, he is always ignored. He thinks that being an adventurer would make him more noticeable. He remembers how the girls standing next to him discussed where Karaboshi Haruki went and who he was. He had never been seen in that class where the teacher called Karaboshi Haruki and asked if he was here when he was standing next to him. The soldier apologizes to Karaboshi Haruki and asks him to show him the documents he gave them. He tells him to go and says that he has to get out of this awkward situation. Somehow, Karaboshi Haruki thought that one day it would happen. And now the time has come for him to no longer be an empty military place. The military asked Karaboshi Haruki if he went down to the basement, and he answered no. The military said it was good because he could enter safely when they set up the barricade. Karaboshi Haruki saw the barricade being built and told the military that they had overcome it so quickly. They said it was their job, and then someone from the military asked Karaboshi Haruki if he didn't lose anything in the basement. He replied that he lost a snow shovel there. The military apologized for the loss and left, saying they thought it was time. Karaboshi Haruki thanked the military for their help. One of them asked him about going for a run, and he replied if the military asked Karaboshi Haruki to do it carefully. He said the barricade was set up carefully, so there was no harm. Karaboshi Haruki thanked the military for their words and thanked them for their leave. The military and Karaboshi Haruki watched him leave in the car. Karaboshi Haruki gathered his belongings and said it was time for him to embark on an adventure beyond the barricade and go down to the basement. Here, Karaboshi Haruki mentioned the console. He studied it and said that everything was there because, according to him, this console was just a magical artifact of an underground prison that they could find in a treasure chest, or after defeating a monster that had different artifact effects that enhanced human abilities. Karaboshi Haruki sat on it and thought that there might be some kind of guide here. He pressed the beginner button, thinking that if he is a beginner, then an orc is the best thing he could possibly develop an artifact or skill points with. Karaboshi Haruki is seen at the table, engrossed in his skills, just like in a game. Karaboshi Haruki looks at his stealth skills and shouts in surprise because this is impossible. Skills are pumped into him to the maximum. Karaboshi Haruki is thinking about what special skill it is. It's not like a hobby or some kind of gift that he sees decoding from the skill afterwards, defeating monsters and getting more points. Then Karaboshi Haruki starts pressing buttons on the console after shouting, "Damn it, he's putting everything into this game!" Karaboshi Haruki shouts in frustration. He should have thought better than he could have pumped something else. Karaboshi Haruki is thinking that he hopes it's possible to redistribute points somehow. He climbs the stairs while saying it well, "Come on, Karaboshi Haruki, go down into the basement and look around." With enthusiasm, Karaboshi Haruki shouts, "Wow!" As he touches the wall and thinks about how bright it is around the walls, it seems like he's studying light. He thought the wall felt like clay but was very hard. He hoped the wall wouldn't collapse. Suddenly he saw a large centipede next to him. He screamed in horror. It was a giant centipede just like the one mentioned in the wiki. Centipede is a monster with the lowest level, but it moves slowly. Its weakness is the antennas on its head. He quickly grabbed a knife and thought about cutting off the antennas. Guided by the antennas, the centipede wouldn't be able to attack if he cut them off. Then, he would finish it off with a powerful blow to the head. The centipede circled around him and he attacked but barely missed. However, the attack still hit him. He said that according to the wiki, centipede is slow, but in real life it's very fast. He smiled and said that everything would be fine. He could handle it. He threw himself into the attack against the insect. He jumped with a knife at the beetle, but the knife didn't penetrate its scales. He realized that the insect's armor was very strong. He thought that the centipede was faster than him, but despite all this, he was still stronger than the screams of Karaboshi Haruki. He was ready. The same thing would happen. Karaboshi Haruki forcefully thrust the knife into the centipede's head and punched it with all his might. Karaboshi Haruki breathed a sigh of relief as the monster was defeated. He fell to the ground exhausted and said that it was his first experience. Karaboshi Haruki got up from his knees and said it was okay. He needed to cut down a large number of centipede before another monster came. Then, something strange started happening to Karaboshi Haruki. He started trembling, making it difficult for him to breathe. Sweat began to drip down his face. Haruki understood that this was a severe case of Karaboshi Haruki disease. He wiped his mouth and sweated, thinking about the strangeness of what he had. It had never happened in Chikuho, right? All because of the accelerated growth of Karaboshi, Haruki wondered if it was all because of centipede. He started slaughtering monsters, thinking that he had gained so much experience for weak monsters like that. This monster's parts could be used as armor. Haruki wondered if it was interesting or generally normal for a first-time experience. He wiped his sweaty forehead after being massively slaughtered by Karaboshi Haruki. Skull Opendra said it was like this and took off the monster's armor. Karaboshi Haruki said that the insect shell and other parts could be a complete set of armor, and all of this could be sold at a good price. Although it would be difficult for him to afford all of this, Karaboshi Haruki looked at the monster's parts and realized that his bag couldn't fit much, and the rest. Karaboshi Haruki took a piece of centipede meat and wondered if it was possible to eat it. He remembered his ancestors splitting monsters into two types, edible and inedible. Haruki cut a piece of meat and put a slimy piece in his mouth. Karaboshi Haruki started chewing the meat. The centipede meat was tasteless and odorless. He chewed the meat and then washed it down with water. He thought that if it was meat from centipede, it should be edible. But what's the point if the meat doesn't taste good? The emergence of the basement room. The price of land has skyrocketed, and there is a shortage of food. Even vegetables have become a privilege for the wealthy. Karaboshi Haruki thought it was a huge shell that could be left behind when it rained. Karaboshi Haruki returned home and took a shower, then sat in front of the computer. While Karaboshi Haruki was drying his hair with a towel, something caught his attention. He noticed updates on an adventure website where adventurers share their experiences with each other, which is very useful for beginners like him. It was mentioned there that the survival rate increases after the first visit to the site. There is a wiki section that explains all the monsters and how to deal with them. Karaboshi Haruki also noticed a bulletin board for exchanging various information in a blog that is updated every day. Karaboshi Haruki clicked on the computer with the mouse. It's not every day someone finds an underground prison in their house, but when the updates were finally done, he was sure everyone would be interested. He published an article about his first experience in the underground prison, commenting on how cool it was and how jealous he was. He shouted about his internet triumph, but an hour later, he only had 3 views. Karaboshi Haruki wondered why. He lowered his head in frustration, thinking about where his millions of views went wrong. Maybe his view count was broken. Let someone tell him that the meter was broken. Karaboshi Haruki stared at his computer screen with tears in his eyes, realizing that his blog wasn't any worse than his friends' top blogs. And then he saw it again, the update ranking. It was the people with the highest rankings in various blog categories. They became adventurers who would usually sign contracts with different companies, getting free weapons and lots of money. One of the rangers returned as Bacon, an enthusiastic old man who didn't wear the clothes he preferred to go to the basement alone and tell everyone that he did it for fun. But his impressive strength amazed. Who was a ranger on the contrary, determined to win. He actively attacked the exploring the basement and exploring it. He was a great strategist and an unwavering ranger, holding the record for the longest adventure in the most difficult underground prison in Shinjuku Station, Japan. Karaboshi Haruki was annoyed, saying that Masatsugu didn't have any new updates. Maybe he was in Karaboshi. Haruki talked about how cool he was and also wanted to become a student again, and a disciple of Karaboshi. Haruki looked at the monitor screen with tears streaming down his face. He opened the Shigure page. She was the only girl who had been with him since the great accident that he had trained in the dojo since childhood, and had never lost a single battle. Karaboshi Haruki saw it. She didn't get the latest news and thought that Shigure was also in a mess. According to her, all these rankers were so cool, and he seemed to not see that he still had 3 views and 0 comments. He mentally screamed and wondered why and started crying because of sadness. Here he knocked his hand hard on the table. He thought he didn't have time to cry and he had an incomprehensible miracle that needed to be learned. An underground prison appeared in his garage. Karaboshi Haruki opened the window and thought that this way she would definitely become stronger and finally be noticed. He decided to go to the underground prison again. Haruki forcefully plunged a dagger into the body of a large centipede. He pulled out the knife and the lifeless insect body fell in front of him. Haruki exhaled and looked at the monster's body at his feet, as well as the other monster bodies lying slightly to the side. Haruki said that he had killed over 100 large shellfish monsters. He saw scattered insect bodies on the floor of the underground prison. Haruki thought he felt a little ashamed of something that felt like hitting a child. Haruki looked at his hands and said that it seemed like his resistance to the disease had improved. He walked and held a map in his hand, pulling it out after making a decision. Haruki went to a new place and thought that, apparently, this was the end of the first floor. Here the gravel crunches beneath Karaboshi Haruki's feet, and then there is a strange sound that emerges from Karaboshi Haruki's head. He looks up and sees a large horde of monsters on the ceiling, which startles him. With a terrified scream, he quickly prepares to defend himself as the insects descend from the ceiling, ready to attack. Karaboshi Haruki pulls out his sword and enters the battle. Suddenly a monster sneaks up behind him, but Karaboshi Haruki swiftly kills it with a swing of his sword. He shouts in triumph, facing the monster with a punch. However, Yesterday, he only killed one monster, and he hasn't realized that he has been losing touch with reality for a while. Karaboshi Haruki stands amidst the bodies of dead insects and looks at the blade in his hand. He says, "Maybe it's all because of my accelerated growth." Karaboshi Haruki sits in front of the insect's body and says, "In Chikaho, you have to compete with other adventurers, and here he killed more than 200 in just a few days." Karaboshi Haruki looks at his hand and thinks that even though his power is growing rapidly, he hasn't realized that even if he becomes physically stronger, his strength is already at its maximum. He doesn't need to do anything more as a beginner. He sees that the blade of his sword is completely damaged and says, "It's time to replace my weapon." Karaboshi Haruki stands in front of the stairs and opens the console. Karaboshi Haruki observes it and says, "It seems there's no boss on this floor and I didn't earn any skill points." Karaboshi Haruki looks at the stairs and says, "Sooner or later, my level will increase." Karaboshi Haruki smiled as he reached the second floor. He looked around, thinking that everything looked exactly the same as he had heard before. The terrain wouldn't change until floor 10, and the deeper he went into the dungeon, the harder it would become. Only about 10% of adventurers reached floor 10, which was considered the intermediate level. The upper level was up to level 10, the middle level was up to level 20, and the lower level was increased by 50 levels. Since all adventurers worked for themselves, there wasn't much information about the lower levels. They also said that the size of the dungeon floor increased as you progressed. Karaboshi Haruki shouted happily as he went through the levels. He couldn't wait to see what kind of monsters would be there. Then, Karaboshi Haruki realized something. He saw plants growing and wondered what was there. Plants emerged from the ground and quickly rushed towards Karaboshi Haruki. He was surprised to see small monsters. Karaboshi Haruki opened his eyes wide in shock, and after a while he stood in the middle of lifeless arches, one of which was gripping a sprout in his hand. He was shocked and didn't understand how it happened. He looked at the chopped and lifeless onions. Karaboshi Haruki opened his mouth and screamed that he couldn't cry anymore. He screamed that his onions were also strong, and he had to go home immediately. Then, Haruki hung his bow on a special shelf in his house yard. Haruki looked at his work and said that he needed to monopolize selling vegetable monsters, at least to take a title like that in the future. Haruki held his sword in his hand, which had been destroyed. Haruki said that vegetable monsters were often hunted, and at the same time his sword was damaged. Haruki decided to go to the weapons store the next day. The girl sat and sighed heavily, talking about how bored she was. She wondered if she would have a normal day today, and sighed heavily again, standing behind the counter of the gun store. Haruki was eating here and clearly enjoyed the food. He thought with a smile that he had a divine taste. He happily thought that the best egg cookers of Kitori were much tastier than scallops. Kitori saw customers like that as a love laugh and said that he was happy. Later, Kitori sat with Haruki on the window and asked him if it really wasn't a burden for him. He said that Haruki brought him so much fresh food, especially onions. He told Kitori with a smile that he could consider it as a thank you for his continuous help. Besides, they were neighbors and had to help each other. They lived 10 minutes away from each other. Kitori leaned his body towards the box of onions. Karaboshi Haruki brought and looked at the vegetables. He closed his eyes sadly and said that once he and his wife collected onions together before she was killed by a monster, and the bow reminded him of his late wife. The man said, "God, why did she die before him? He missed her so much." Karaboshi Haruki, with tired and sad eyes, didn't know what to say to the man. Then he went to the car and apologized to Kitori for having to feed him. Kitori replied to Karaboshi Haruki that it was okay and thanked him. Finally, he asked Karaboshi Haruki if he would go to the underground prison again. Karaboshi Haruki replied with a smile and said, but first he had something else to do. Did Karaboshi Haruki bring a centipede shell to the store? The girl there was very surprised and didn't understand what was in front of her about him. And once again, like everyone else, she didn't pay attention to Haruki's efforts to get the shopkeeper's attention. When she shouted loudly, "I'm here!" The girl screamed in horror. Haruki pointed to a pile of centipede shells in front of him and asked the shopkeeper to evaluate what he brought. The girl looked around at the shells and asked if they all belonged to him. He answered, smiling, that he brought around 200 centipede shells. The girl asked Haruki if all the shells were his, and he answered, yes, that's correct. Haruki felt proud. The girl spoke well and soon asked Haruki to wait a moment, then told him that the evaluation was finished. She counted 216 undamaged shells, priced at 1,000 yen each, and the scratched one costs 100 yen per piece. The girl pointed her finger at the document and the result was 153,800 yen. The girl asked Karaboshi Haruki if he was satisfied with that amount of money transferred to his card. He was surprised by this arrangement. Then Karaboshi Haruki looked at the document with a smile and thought that the glasses were from the website, adding an extra 5%. So the total amount came out to be 161.50 yen. He mentally thanked Scallop Pender, thanked the seller, and thought that now he would have something to buy gasoline with. Karaboshi Haruki was thinking about where he should go next, and later he came to the store with the pistol he saw in the iron armor and said that he was so happy here. Karaboshi Haruki looked in that direction and saw a sword standing behind the glass. He smiled and thought that these two-handed swords were really cool, used by many adventurers to go to dungeons with them. This weapon is the spirit of adventure. Karaboshi Haruki thought that a dagger would be more suitable for his drawing, so that he would stand out from the others. He imagined how he would fight, and the people watching would cheer happily that Karaboshi Haruki was fighting against such a monster alone. His attention was drawn to a shelf with a dagger. He saw a human wolf dagger worth 1 million yen. He was shocked to think about it. A weapon worth 1 million yen. Karaboshi Haruki thought that the price was expected for a middle-class weapon. A girl approached him and greeted him. She asked Karaboshi Haruki if he liked it. Karaboshi Haruki didn't know what to answer, and the girl said that if that's the case, she would now open the display case for him. Karaboshi Haruki was surprised to think about it. This girl had noticed his presence. Karaboshi Haruki turned away from the girl. Whoever opened the window was thinking about how nervous they were. Even more so when Centipede's Karaboshi Haruki thought about it. He was very happy at that moment. The girl called him and he opened the window, asking Karaboshi Haruki if he wanted to hold or try the Karaboshi Haruki knife. Karaboshi Haruki took the werewolf's silver dagger in his hand, and then his eyes opened wide in surprise. He was sweating and angry, shouting that he couldn't take the weapon. The girl smiled and told Karaboshi Haruki that her weapon was made from the material of the underground prison itself, chosen by the same owner. Hearing her words, Karaboshi Haruki thought that this was what it was, and imagined that a mid-level adventurer could use the weapon against mid-level monsters, but couldn't use it against high-level monsters. The girl smiled and told Karaboshi Haruki that if this weapon didn't suit him, maybe he could try another model that was slightly more expensive but very good in battle. Karaboshi Haruki looked at the newly introduced weapon and was shocked. He took his dagger and thought that it was a bit heavy but comfortable enough, according to the girl who was selling it. She told Karaboshi Haruki that she had a silver wolf dagger in her hand and spun it around, trying it in her hand. The girl said that it seemed like this weapon suited him. Haruki informed him exactly with a smile. He asked him why he sold equipment that didn't suit the customers. All the girls answered him that there were people who bought equipment based on its appearance and cost, and then he remembered a man yelling at him about it. Why was his sword so bad? He demanded him to return the money to him, but quickly moved. Haruki told the girl that he did indeed experience difficulties. She answered with a smile that she didn't allow such types to get away with it. She imagined hitting the man who scolded her with her weapon while smiling. She told Haruki not to worry. He would definitely know. Haruki's face screamed that he was indeed like that. He would not return the dagger at all, and the girl couldn't worry. The girl apologized to Haruki for her question, but he asked her if she was an average-level adventurer. Haruki answered that no, he was still a beginner. The surprised girl said that it was true, but his protective armor was indeed Karaboshi Haruki, who was really tired, scratched the back of his head with a smile and said that he was not at all, he just wasn't very experienced yet. The girl touched his armor and said that there were a lot of scratches on it. The girl jumped on the table and sat on it. Haruki thought about how to deafen the girl. He also told her that what she was doing was a reckless act. The girl leaned towards Karaboshi Haruki and said she didn't want him to die. She asked Karaboshi Haruki if he was right. He shouted back at her that no, he was not right. The girl asked Karaboshi Haruki about it. She couldn't wear better armor or she could, but Karaboshi Haruki didn't let her. She finished shouting that she would buy this armor for the sake of the girl, and then she sold the strange mask for 500 yen, the beetle armor for 50,000 yen, and the silver wolf dagger for 98,000 yen. Karaboshi Haruki left the store, leaving behind 148,500 yen. The girl shouted behind him, thanking the salesgirl. She would turn 27 years old this year and she worked as a salesman at a Bishi weapons store. She shouted while smiling, amazed that it was a full class. She couldn't believe she had just met the norm that she had mentioned. Oh God, how difficult it was for her to develop her skills to such a level. The mask had a terrible smell that no one wanted to buy, yet she managed to sell it. This person was so easily fooled into buying things. Yuduki Akane, also known as a window shopper, walked around the store with a smile and said that she had to go to the next one to show off. Then she noticed something she remembered. How Karaboshi Haruki took the silver wolf dagger. The dagger couldn't be used without reaching at least the average level. The silver wolf was a monster that appeared on the 6th floor of the underground prison in Chicago. Its fangs were usually made into high-quality weapons, ideal for medium-level adventurers. She was curious why he told her that he was a beginner here. He still thinks and says that even though he doesn't really care and ignores it, Haruki stands with him in the purchase and shouts in surprise about his reasons. He only bought so much, and then many people gathered on the 1st floor of the underground prison in Chicago. Haruki entered the crowd and looked around at the people around him, thinking so, after what happened in the underground prison in the garage, he didn't understand why Chicago attracted so many people, but those people were attracted by a large number of monsters. Haruki thought with a smile, which he always did against monsters only on the 1st and 2nd floors, but today everything would be fine. It would be different. Haruki thought that one day he would go to the lowest level of the underground prison. Haruki went down and then sat down and studied his console. Haruki said that his level had increased. He learned about the console's thinking because he knew his level had increased when he went down to the dungeon floor and also gained skill points. It seemed like he couldn't acquire skills outside the underground if the monsters were too weak here. Suddenly, Haruki killed a big beetle with one punch. Haruki looked at the insect's corpse and said that it was very weak. It seemed like the centipede didn't want to give him any more trouble. Haruki looked at his weapon and thought that its speed and power were caused by the sword, which made the shopkeeper scared. He blushed, remembering that the girl was the saleswoman. She shouted loudly, "Okay, it's time for you to do it!" Haruki descended while thinking that there should be fewer people there now, but this meant that there would be even more monsters. Then Karaboshi Haruki heard someone scream, and a rabbit fell onto Karaboshi Haruki. Immediately, a person ran towards him, chasing after the rabbit. This wasn't just any rabbit, Karaboshi Haruki thought. It was a killer rabbit. The attack was so powerful not because of its new armor but because it had finished its transformation. Now the killer rabbit swiftly attacked its victims with its strong claws, flesh, and horns. A male rabbit could be sold at a high price. Karaboshi Haruki screamed, realizing that the rabbit was much stronger than a centipede. He felt that the rabbit wanted to kill him. Karaboshi Haruki laughed and instantly transformed into a killer rabbit, leaping towards him again. Karaboshi Haruki covered himself with his hands, defending himself from the attack. He threw the rabbit back, and the monster landed on the ground. He quickly pushed it away with his own claws and rushed to attack again. When the rabbit attacked Karaboshi Haruki, Haruki dropped the rabbit to the ground with his dagger, and the creature fell without Karaboshi Haruki's power. Haruki gasped for breath and shockingly said that he killed the monster. 3 other adventurers ran towards him asking what happened. They had just caught up with this killer rabbit monster, and Haruki apologized to them with a smile, saying that he had already finished off his rabbit. But the people seemed not to notice, and said that something killed the rabbit before they arrived here. Karaboshi Haruki looked at his trembling hands and wondered what had happened to him. Why was he shaking like this? Was it because of the monster that the adventurers had mentioned? Well, he hoped they would take their time discussing it and shout when the monster parade was about to start. Then Karaboshi Haruki widened his eyes, thinking about what the people in front of him were talking about. He hoped their distraction would delay them, and soon 3 of the adventurers ran past him. Karaboshi Haruki sat on the ground, got up, and ran in the opposite direction from them. Someone was walking in the middle of the crowd. It was a girl walking through the crowd. Then someone asked her who she was, not Karen-chan by chance. Confused, she said yes. She was Karen. Immediately 3 people started discussing her answer, saying that it was true. One of them had written about the recruitment search form, and they thought it was trolling or something. Karen lowered her head in front of the people, and she said that she relied on them today. They answered that they also relied on him. They were happy to meet him. Those people introduced themselves. Their name are Shikama, Lars Kashima, and Haria Kashima leaned towards her. Karen said that she knew they had just met, but she was interested in how old Karen was. She answered that she was 18 years old. Haria, who was 1 year old, asked Karen if this was really her just reaching the age of hearing. Lars asked the others if they could rely on Karen. He closed his mouth after such a question, and then Lars said it was better than being alone with the newcomer, Shikama. Haria supported him by saying that it was truly better than staying naked with Shikama and his sword. Karen looked down sadly and thought that she should check her equipment. Kashima coughed and told Karen a story. Okay, it's time for them to go. He's new here, so he doesn't need to overdo it. The main thing he needs to do is always stay close to them. Karen said it's good that they usually go down to the 9th floor. Then, they should hurry down later. Karen bent down and took a deep breath. Then someone touched her hand and asked if everything was okay with her. It was Kashima standing next to her. Karen looked towards them and said that she looked tired. Lara said that looking at her condition, it's not surprising since she's still a beginner. Karen thought that she felt uneasy because she killed a high-level monster. She didn't know if she could get up. Then Kashima shouted to the others that they need a break. Karen immediately shouted that she didn't need a break, she was fine. Kashima responded nicely and quickly added that for an ordinary girl, Karen was very brave. She looked at her in surprise, and Kashima continued by saying that adventurers usually don't go down to the first 2 floors, because it's quite dangerous down there. Karen opened her eyes in shock as Haria stood in front of them, ready for battle. Wars sneaked towards him and asked about the fact that their opponent was already here. Haria replied that they weren't, but they would arrive soon. Taran said it was bad, and asked what they should do. Haria shouted back, "Isn't it obvious?" Lars grabbed his weapon and chased after him. Haria shouted that they should get out of here. Karen and Kashima turned around in surprise after they shouted. Karen asked why they were running too. Kashima ran after his comrades and shouted that the Mon parade was approaching. Karen asked in surprise about the Mon parade. Kashima shouted at her that it was a monster parade coming. Karen opened her eyes wide and was shocked. A monster parade meant a massive influx of monsters into the dungeon. The reasons might be different, but it was better for adventurers to stay away from it. Karen started trembling and looked deep into the cave. She could hear the footsteps of many monsters. She understood that she needed to run at that moment. She noticed that Kashima, Lars, and Haria had already run far ahead. She was shocked to think that they had run away without her. She shouted at them to wait for her. She ran towards them and her friends stopped. Kashima shouted at her that she was digging her own grave and Lars called her a foolish girl who was being hunted. Kashima asked her to help him, but Lars held him back and shouted at her asking what she was doing. She replied that he couldn't be called a man unless he helped Karen. Haria shouted that someone was fighting in front, as heard from the voice, and Lars immediately started mocking him. It seemed that he wanted to fall into their trap. They couldn't wait. and thus took the risk. Karen, on the other hand, didn't run towards them, understanding what they were arguing about. Kashima, Lars, and Haria stopped and immediately got involved in a fight. Karen looked at them in surprise, not understanding their behavior. She wondered what they would do against her. She couldn't believe it, but she was glad to have strong people around her. Karen almost reached the thought that she needed to support them so as not to get hit, and then Kashima forcefully hit her with a shield. Karen flew away and fell to the ground, leaving a layer of dust. She looked shocked in front of her, thinking about what had happened. Kashima stared at her mockingly, asking for forgiveness and saying that someone had to do it as bait. They let Karen lie on the ground while shouting that it was indeed time for them to get out of here. Kashima, Lars, and Haria ran away, leaving Karen lying on the ground with her arms outstretched towards them. She was unable to move, lying there on the ground. Then she heard a sound and turned around in horror to see a large pack of killer rabbits approaching her. They sniffed around her from all sides as Karen looked at them and burst into tears. She thought she didn't deserve to live and begged someone to save her. Just then, Haruki rushed towards her as fast as he could. The sound grew louder in his head as he looked around and saw a large pack of killer rabbits approaching. Haruki knew that Karen was surrounded by a large group of monsters from all sides. Haruki's hands trembled as tears streamed down his cheeks. He opened his skill panel and began studying its characteristics, thinking that they were okay for now, even though it wasn't enough. But he had to try. Haruki put on his mask and thought that every point of strength would be useful for him. He hurried towards Karen and screamed in horror. Karen closed her eyes, preparing to face death, but then she was saved by Haruki, who cut through the crowd of rabbits. Karen looked at him in surprise, and the remaining killer rabbits quickly jumped over them and rushed towards Haruki. Karaboshi Haruki met them with his sword in hand. The rabbit leaped into the air and attacked Haruki, but he swiftly countered with a single punch. Haruki thought to himself that it was just one skill point. Every Haruki rushed into the battlefield, feeling that something was different. Even though they had improved, only one part of their body was burned. They were in severe pain, and their head was splitting. Haruki thought with a smile that he was starting to enjoy all the fights with Karaboshi Haruki the rabbit, and thought that this was the true spirit of adventure of Karaboshi Haruki. He was panting, and then he looked up at the ceiling in surprise. Karaboshi Haruki sighed heavily, and the bodies of the killer rabbits lay around him wherever he said loudly that he was glad he survived in the end. Then he noticed Karen, who was already active on her feet. He looked towards Karaboshi Haruki in shock and fear of something. He thought that Karen was afraid of his mask. Karen apologized to Karaboshi Haruki for that strange voice. Karaboshi Haruki replied to her that everything was fine according to him. He thought to himself that he could still take off his mask. Karen touched Karaboshi Haruki's mask with her hand and looked at him in surprise. Karen, while crying, said to Karaboshi Haruki, "Thank you so much for saving me." Karaboshi Haruki didn't immediately know what to answer, and the only thing he could say was, he said it didn't matter that Karen cried, and said that he really thought so. When she finished, her tears fell on Karaboshi Haruki's hand as he stared at her in surprise, and then Karen went berserk. Karaboshi Haruki thought that this girl survived thanks to him. He was glad he managed to save her. Later, Karaboshi Haruki filled his bag with the body of the killer rabbit. He thanked Karen for helping him gather all this material. He didn't know how to deal with it since then. He didn't mention Karen's name. Karen soon realized her mistake and introduced herself. Karaboshi Haruki answered by telling her his name, and noticed that she wouldn't go to take off the mask that Karaboshi Haruki took from his bag and said it was time to go back. Karen asked for his permission to take her from the bag. Karaboshi Haruki asked her if she was sure about that decision. Karen took her bag and asked Karaboshi Haruki if he was a ranger. He answered that he was not. He was just a beginner. Karen screamed in surprise. How could he be a beginner going up against a crowd of monsters when he was just a beginner? Karaboshi Haruki said, "There's something that pushed him to do this." Karen asked him if his words were true. He thought to himself that he was right, surprised by Karaboshi Haruki's actions. He thought it was all thanks to his panel skills, but even if he told Karen about it loudly, Karaboshi Haruki said it. He met a group of adventurers consisting of 3 people while walking towards the monster. He asked Karen if she knew them. He lowered his gaze and said, "Well, what he's thinking is something." He replied to Karaboshi Haruki that these people took him to their party. He met them in a forum and thought they would help him level up, but Karen gripped her weapon with force. Karaboshi Haruki saw his understanding of everything. He thought his duty as an adventurer was to protect people. He couldn't forgive those who were careless about their work or left the weak behind. Of course, there are times when it's better to leave your comrades, except for these people. He remembered Lars, Haria shout and Kasima shout, "Let's run from here, we should leave early." Karen had just baited Karaboshi. Haruki concluded like that. People couldn't be forgiven. Yuduki Akane instructed the girl to look at him again, showing her the situation and telling the bespectacled girl that her store's income had increased by 200% compared to last year, and what she owned had increased by 200%. The girl screamed at Yuduki Akane, similar to her silence, which annoyed her. She asked the girl about how her store was doing. "Is everything okay with it?" The girl angrily clenched her teeth and answered, despite the fact that they were both managers, she was Yuduki Akane's boss. And did she forget about her attitude? Yuduki Akane replied to the girl that she was her boss just because she worked longer. Yuduki Akane jumped onto the table and said that everyone was only interested in the results she asked for, who and what among them was clearly superior. Did she have a young and beautiful girl with worthy results, or did she have an average-looking old woman in her place? Anger screamed at her about who she was calling an old woman here. Someone interrupted the dialogue of the girls and said, "I apologize immediately, Yuduki Akane and the girl." They both looked angrily at the newcomer they had in their business. They all smiled and welcomed Karaboshi Haruki, who still hadn't taken off his mask. He said he had a bag full of dead rabbit horns in his hands. Karen stood behind him, and the girls looked at them in surprise. Karaboshi Haruki told the girls that he wanted to sell everything and asked the bespectacled girl, who was staring at Yuduki Akane, to check the materials. She immediately hid behind the red shock counter when she saw his mask. She thought that this must be the same client who was with her recently. The bespectacled girl looked towards the products offered by Karaboshi Haruki and asked him if these were the horns of the killer rabbit. She wondered if his words had piqued Yuduki Akane's interest. Karen said she thought she had about 100 of these horns. The shocked girl screamed after her words. Yuduki Akane was thinking that the killer rabbit was not a monster that a beginner could handle, and he put 10 in one night. He was very surprised, even though he was not a female and did not have horns, so there might be more killer rabbits in the fight with Karaboshi Haruki. If he could handle it, then he was definitely not a beginner. The bespectacled girl thanked Karaboshi Haruki and Karen for waiting for her. She said that this was her gift for the 101 killer rabbit horns she obtained, which cost 22,000. However, she asked Karaboshi Haruki if everything was suitable for her. He answered yes, of course. The girl asked Karaboshi Haruki if she could use the command function as a response. She asked him what it was, and the girl answered that it was a function where the amount of remuneration is divided and paid to each point of service participant in the party. Karen listened to the girl with interest, and Karaboshi Haruki also listened after that. He said that he understands everything, so they will do it. Karen opened her eyes in surprise and immediately shouted at Karaboshi Haruki that it wasn't necessary, he didn't have to do anything. Karaboshi Haruki laughed and asked Karen if she would help him carry all of this. Karen replied that that's all she could do. Wasn't she helping Karaboshi Haruki fight the killer rabbit boss? Haruki told Karen that it was because he owed her since then. Karen brought 48 horns that she would receive half the amount for. That's what happened. Karen deserved his help. Yuduki Akane opened her eyes and was shocked after his words. He thought this girl only brought horns, but all these monsters were killed by this man. The girl with glasses told Karaboshi Haruki that she apologized, but she couldn't pay half the amount for 48 horns here. Yuduki Akane was jumping out of his hiding place and grabbing the girl on his shoulder. She shouted at him to come here. Karaboshi Haruki saw them startled, and then the girls disappeared behind the counter. Karaboshi Haruki realized that Yuduki Akane Aken seemed familiar to him. Yuduki Akane Aken asked the girl why she didn't want to read the amount of her prize. He whispered the question to the girl, and she answered him that if she recounted, she would have to work again. The girl kept saying that she was very sensitive about recycling, and she also didn't want her boss to shout at Yuduki. Akane listened to her and said that he asked the girl who she really was, stupid or something. He would explain in principle why this worked so slowly. The girl responded angrily, shouting at Yuduki Akane again that she wanted him to say it in his own words and get out from behind the counter. And Karaboshi Haruki asked Dan to apologize to him. "Wait a minute," he replied. Karaboshi Haruki armed himself with horns and started doing it. After a while he handed Karaboshi Haruki and Karen their cards and thanked them for waiting. The payment card for 53 horns and the remaining 50% for 48 horns were transferred to their account. The girl with glasses behind them twisted Karaboshi Haruki's arm because she was angry. Haruki and Karen left, listening to the cry. "Thank you, Karaboshi." Haruki looked back at the store and thought for sure it was a girl from the store. After Haruki and Karen left, the girl with glasses shouted at Yuduki Akane, who was still bowing, asking who she was letting herself be. Yuduki Akane replied to her that he wanted to ask her the same thing. Something, and then he shouted loudly that it was a very important client. He kept telling the girl that even so he would obey every word she said. The boss is just a buyer who brings money, so sometimes you can turn a blind eye to his orders. The girl really didn't understand that she was being rude to her boss and customers. The girl replied to Yuduki Akane that she would report her sister to her today. Yuduki Akane leaned back and closed her eyes, saying, "All right, she doesn't care. The day will come when she says thank you." The girl turned away from her and said, "Yes, of course, Yuduki Akane." Haruki smiled, approached his car and said it wouldn't start. Karen ran towards him and called out, asking how she could thank him, as she didn't quite understand her question. Haruki replied that there was no need for thanks. He wanted to save her and he did. Karen answered that she wanted to say thank you. Karen answered that if she could somehow repay him, Haruki didn't care what it was, just let her know if she needed anything. Karaboshi Haruki looked surprised. He didn't quite understand Karen's words. He froze, thinking that Karen didn't mean anything. He was thinking about the pure gratitude that Karen's lips expressed. This girl and Haruki quickly jumped into the car and shouted at Karen not to do it, sweating and quickly forgetting about it. Karen watched her car in shock as Karaboshi Haruki returned home. He opened the door and entered his apartment, thinking how tired he was, unsure if he would do it, until he got home today. Karaboshi Haruki collapsed on the bed and said, "So tired." Then, lying on the pillow, he understood something. He stood up and touched his face. He screamed while wearing a mask all the time, and I completely forgot about his mask. Haruki understood that this was the reason why the man at the reception was so scared, and why Haruki's mask was terrifying. Haruki couldn't stop thinking about it, and it gave him chills. His appearance must have looked really creepy with the mask on. Haruki took off his mask and looked at it in his hand, thinking that it was just a temporary thing. While wearing the mask, he didn't worry about anything, as if everything was in a dream. He remembered the girl's reaction to his appearance and thought that no one had ever noticed him before. He seemed more transparent than air, but today they finally noticed him, and he could feel that he existed. Haruki said something cool about this mask. Then, Haruki arrived at the Strong Tavern where there were many people. Everyone was drinking and chatting. Haruki sat at a table holding a glass in his hand. He was squeezed on both sides by people who didn't pay attention to him. Haruki thought that he finally decided to come to this popular tavern that was often written about in forums. Haruki placed his cup on the table and thought that a glass of beer here cost 2,000. But today was a special day. However, Haruki's thoughts were interrupted by his neighbor who raised his hand and shouted to take the order. He accidentally pushed Haruki's cup without realizing it and poured his beer. The man turned around and referred to Haruki, saying that he was such a soft wall that no one noticed him at all. Then another man approached him and told him that he saw a strange masked man today. They started discussing what they both saw. This person, with a dagger. Haruki looked at everyone with great interest as they discussed various topics over a glass of beer. He couldn't help but notice that the guy in the mask didn't appeal to him at all. He found it strange how he dressed so oddly, even wearing that weird mask. Frustrated, Haruki squeezed his beer glass tightly, thinking that this was what filled his eyes while tears streamed down his face. Haruki thought about how the stranger had seen him and discussed him, and it made him happy. Suddenly Haruki stood up and shouted loudly that he needed more beer, scaring the person sitting next to him who hadn't noticed him before. To his surprise, there was someone sitting next to them all along, quietly minding their own business. Haruki thought about how he needed a drink, considering the fact that he was no longer more transparent than the air. Soon enough, a waiter came up to him from behind, and he said that he brought an order for an empty seat, like no one else noticed it. Haruki was very annoyed by this fact. He said that he might have to go back to the hotel. He was watching a post about fighting monster parades, and with a smile he said that today he would have great content. It would definitely attract an audience, he thought. Karen came to mind and he thought that the girl said she also ran a blog. Haruki found Karen's blog on the internet. She posted a post titled, "I used to be saved." It started with those words. She would never forgive those adventurers and thanked the person who saved her, Haruki. He read these words with a smile, and then his eyes opened in surprise. He saw that Karen had 14 posts, and they had been tagged 1043 times. Haruki put down his phone and said tears welled up in his eyes. Thinking that it was time for him to sleep here, the discussion began in an escape from a private conversation about the monster parade. There have been over 500 comments, and some of them seem to be divorce-related. God, you're such an idiot. You can't just crash a monster parade, go home and write a post about it. It seems that there is indeed an adventurer who feels sorry for this adventurer. He understands that there is someone else blogging with him. They can't get in touch without ignoring anything. It's an adventurer's nickname for someone who decides to subscribe to his updates. It's a shame that someone else also decided to subscribe, but there are no readers who see this, my friend. How do they know his nickname when morning comes? Haruki opened his laptop and was surprised to see the screen. He was shocked, thinking about this seriously. His post had 5 views, and he had 3 people in it. Karaboshi Haruki happily opened the curtains, thinking that finally someone had added him to their bookmarks. He noticed the presence of Karaboshi Haruki, who had finally been noticed by someone. Karaboshi Haruki put on a mask and thought it was okay. It was time for him to get ready to go home. According to him, it would be good to go down to the basement, level up, but then he froze and thought in surprise because no, he couldn't go home. He remembered the 3 adventurers and Karen and thought that he needed to find them. Well, that girl had a blog. He could just send her a message. Besides, it would be difficult to find her here. Karaboshi Haruki entered the crowd of people and thought about it. But then he met Karen, who recognized him and approached him with a smile. Haruki was surprised that she knew him and paid attention to him. He looked at her with astonishment as Karen greeted him good morning. Haruki replied, good morning to her, and then asked Karen what she saw. However, he hadn't even called her by her name yet. Haruki thought it was common for the first time in someone's life to call him by his name. Karen told Haruki with just a smile that it was only her mask that stood out. Haruki was surprised to think about it, forgetting that he was wearing his own mask. He touched his face in disbelief, happily thinking that this mask was superb. He remembered the smiling shop assistant, and thinking that he only gave 500 yen for a cool mask that the shopkeeper should have. The monument that Karen saw his strange actions and asked Karaboshi Haruki if everything was okay. She saw him very excited. Karaboshi Haruki answered her correctly, and then she said, "What about the adventurer?" But then she heard something strange behind her. She turned around and Karen saw the same thing. She called his name and stared at Kashima Lars and Haria. Karaboshi Haruki realized that this was the person and the same call Karen. She didn't understand what he wanted from her. Karaboshi Haruki asked her not to go anywhere. She thought about what she knew about Kashima, Lars, and Haria. They came to check if Karen was safe. If they saw her, she was still alive at that time, so she wouldn't tell anyone the truth. They would threaten her and maybe even kill Karen. Karaboshi Haruki thought about how the adventurer was, although Kashima, Lars, and Haria were not like that person. It was time to answer Kashima, Lars, and Haria. Karaboshi Haruki saw that he was wearing a mask and shouted that it was impossible. They accepted the fighting position and prepared for it. They fought directly with Kashima, Lars, and Haria. The crowd rushed to attack Haruki and Karaboshi Haruki Karen. She was scared, and Karaboshi Haruki thought it was impossible. He also took a fighting position, thinking that Kashima was running towards him with his shield. With a large number of people and what he had. What was his relationship with a little girl? What are they thinking? Haruki is watching his opponent and thinking that if he dodges the shield, arrows will fly after him, and if he faces Archer, he will be attacked with a sword. Haruki thinks he needs to take a closer look. There must be a way out, but Kashima is already approaching him and attacking. Haruki is surprised, thinking that he moved so fast, and then Kashima throws himself towards him with a sword, while smiling. Then someone gets between Haruki and Kashima and destroys Kashima's weapon with his sword. Haruki is shocked and releases it from his hand. Kashima flies to the side after that. Haruki sees all this in astonishment. The sword master stands between them, looking at them sternly, asking them what they have planned here. On the other hand, Kashima looks towards the sword master, shocked and lying on the ground, and opens his mouth. Haruki also looks at this warrior in surprise. Someone shouts that it's Masatsugu. Karen looks at him in the same way. The people around them open their mouths in admiration and take out their phones. Haruki is thinking about when Masatsugu-san will appear among them. He can't even catch his movements. Karen shouts at Masatsugu, but she is interrupted by Kashima shouting at Masatsugu. Haruki and Karen attack them. First, they hold their monster parade, thinking they are done hearing this. Haruki becomes angry and thinks about what kind of adventurers they are. They soon start discussing this, and Haruki and Karen leave their companions during this monster parade. Usually the Sand team looked towards Karaboshi Haruki and asked him firmly if it was true. Haruki put his hand on Karen and answered, no. These people went to the underground prison with this girl but found a parade of monsters. Then they abandoned Karen to buy time to see Masatsugu. Sadly, he said it was all clear, and immediately asked Karen if she was really experiencing difficulties. War screamed and shocked them, and the three of them started screaming at Masatsugu, saying that they truly believed in the words of the people they were risking their lives for. Masatsui replied that it didn't matter whether he believed it or not. He turned to the three adventurers and said that they didn't wield weapons, so their opinion didn't mean anything. Kashima shouted at Masatsugu. Since he started talking about it, he had to see this guy just by looking at Haruki's expression. You can understand that it is indeed self-defense. Then two police officers approached them, and Haruki asked Kashima what they would do if the police were interested in what he was doing. Then the police officers noticed Masatsugi-san, and then they enthusiastically shouted. Haruki's fans thought about how the police would sort it out. The police started asking Masatsugu about what happened here, and he told them that Karen asked Haruki what was going well, because she answered that it would be better if that was the end. After a while, the police officers took Lars, Kashima, and Haruki away. Some say that the police took him away without explanation, without questions. They owe a debt of gratitude to Masatsugu-san for helping them handle it. This trio is here, and Masatsugu-san pays attention to Haruki and says, "Oh yeah." He approached Haruki and asked him about his name. He was surprised that it was Masatsugu-san who also called him Karen standing next to him. Haruki replied to Masatsugu giving him a name, and he said that his nickname on the site he had no answer. Masatsugu smiled. That's how it is. And then he added that no one is strong enough to surprise Haruki, and he said words like that. I don't know why he didn't expect it. He thought to himself that it was sarcasm or praise. But why did Masatsugu say words like that as an answer to what he told Haruki? Because he couldn't possibly be afraid of a situation like that. Because the fact is, Haruki spent a lot of time in this dungeon. It has become a habit for him. Not Haruki closed his eyes and thought that it really became a habit. Masatsu Gwen told Haruki that when everyone he had met, he was the least noticeable. It was just an extraordinary skill. Haruki shouted that it wasn't his problem, but thanked Masatsugu for the kind words. Masatsugu narrowed his eyes and told Haruki that he also looked good, very close to Haruki's car, and stared into his eyes through a gap in Masatsugu's mask. Masatsugu bowed towards him and whispered in Haruki's ear that it would be better for him if he didn't show up in town for a while. Haruki asked him about the fact that an effort would be made against him. Masatsugu replied that it was beyond the question. He pointed his finger behind his back and said that he would handle this trio for now. Haruki replied to Masatsugu that he didn't want to bother him with it. He replied to Haruki that if people decide that all adventurers are like that, it could be a problem for others, and Masatsugu would also be in trouble if people thought he was the same as the three. Masatsugu said that he would be in Sapporo for a while. Furthermore, Haruki asked what it was like, then he could let it go in a Masatsugu. He answered, of course, this trio is already rotten, so we need to do something about it in principle. They understand each other. Karaboshi, Haruki left the crowd. Karaboshi. Haruki looked at the tablet and thought that he was looking for someone's status for the first time, besides Masatsugi. San is a top ranger. And this is a very rare opportunity now. Karaboshi Haruki knows who he will really respect on Karaboshi. Haruki is studying the skills and characteristics of Masatsugu and Karaboshi. Haruki was surprised and shouted, "How is Masatsugu rank?" "Exactly, he's the top forest guardian, and even with the divine armor Shinigami, if Masatsugu has the divine armor, then God himself will help him." Karaboshi Haruki thought that he needed more information, but then the button from his panel disappeared. Karaboshi Haruki looked at the bend and thought that Masatsugu must have already left. Karaboshi Haruki thought that Masatsugu-san had disappeared from the tablet's range, so he disappeared. He wanted to know more about divine protection. At least I have time to consider the basics of Masatsugu's skills. Then Karen came. It's up to her to say that she finally found it. She turned to Karaboshi Haruki and asked him to help her bring it with her. Karaboshi Haruki looked at her in surprise. Karen said that what she meant was one of Masatsugu-san's discussions about it, besides the underground prison that Karaboshi Haruki had at home. She was shocked by her words. She immediately mentioned the weather she was thinking about to herself about how Karen knew about it. She told Karaboshi Haruki that she said her nickname was wrong. She found it online. Karaboshi Haruki was the same, no one sang, who wrote the article. "I have an underground prison at home," Karaboshi Haruki answered. Karen said that she had already done it in her spare time. She read the latest addition to the article in the forum. Karaboshi Haruki thought that one of the readers was standing in front of him. How unusual it was. Karen asked Karaboshi Haruki with a smile, so they left. He answered, "No, we have to wait there. There's definitely nothing interesting in his town." Karen asked Karaboshi Haruki if there was an underground prison there. Karaboshi Haruki answered yes, but it's far from here. There's a noble wilderness. She asked Ken if his parents wouldn't worry about him. Karen sadly answered that everything was fine. Karaboshi Haruki didn't know what to say and fell silent for a while. He told Karen that everything was fine. He smiled and looked at her. Haruki got behind the wheel and Karen sat next to him. Haruki thought this girl was definitely an adventurer, just like him, and decided to risk his life with her. "Do your best, Haruki," Karen said loudly, as if she knew his feelings of losing something precious. "Okay, we'll go to the underground prison," she said. Haruki and Karen left, with Karen happily looking out the window. After a few minutes, her gaze changed. "Where are we going? This is really a remote place," she said. Haruki laughed and they arrived at the garage. Karen looked amazed in front of her and said, "While inside the underground prison right in the garage, it's really cool to have a dungeon next to your house." Haruki answered, saying that Karen reminded him and asked Haruki where he could sell all kinds of things here. But he was bothered by Karaboshi Haruki and answered that there was nothing here. Karen realized they were in the wilderness and asked Karen about the fact that there was not even a weapons store here. Karaboshi Haruki asked Karen not to look at him like that and not to ask him stupid questions. Karaboshi Haruki kept saying that you couldn't even order anything from an online store here. Karen said there was an underground prison here. Karaboshi Haruki replied that at least it was something good here. He asked Karen if they were coming. Karaboshi Haruki stepped down and asked Karaboshi Haruki if he knew what kind of monster lived here. He answered that it was a centipede and asked if this was true. Karaboshi Haruki replied yes and said that he seemed to have read his blog carefully. Karen asked not to worry, saying that centipede was not dangerous, but they could destroy his armor, so Karen should be careful. He answered that he understood everything. Karaboshi Haruki saw it and thought that his armor was fair. He wore a robe and Karen's weapon was a staff made of roots, and he also had leather boots. The materials for destroying the existing armor were obtained from defeated monsters, so it was not popular among adventurers. Besides, it was very difficult to communicate with Model B from the Manhwa company. Karaboshi Haruki thought that Karen was a maniac because he read all the latest blog updates, but at the same time, he chose to stay away from the best weapons. Karaboshi Haruki thought it was very interesting. He decided that he would ask Karen about it. The centipede approached them. It was very big. Karen was shocked and looked at him with horror. Haruki's reaction told Karen that everything was fine. Karen trembled and said that her heart almost stopped. Haruki told Karen that this was a rare opportunity. Let her kill the bug she stepped on, the monster's leg. Haruki asked Karen what she was waiting for. Karen screamed in horror. Haruki told her that the weak point of the centipede was its head. Karen screamed at Haruki, asking why he did it so calmly that he didn't understand her reaction. Karen also screamed at him, asking if he felt disgusted. Haruki answered that the centipede was cute. Karen screamed in surprise. Haruki asked her why she said that. After all, the centipede moved its claws very coolly. But Karen interrupted him while screaming at him to stop, or he would die. Haruki shivered and asked Karen about it. When the terrifying monster appeared, he would do the same and turn away from her. Haruki told Karen that the centipede wouldn't kill her, but another monster would if she turned away from it because she opposed it. Whether she understood it or not, Karen almost cried, and Haruki continued to tell her that she was a little girl who was afraid of every bug or an adventurer facing danger. Haruki asked Karen who she was. Karen tightened her grip on her weapon and went towards Haruki at centipede. He raised his staff to attack, trembling as he approached, and quickly lowered his weapon right on the head of the centipede. Then Karen turned and covered her mouth as she vomited. Haruki looked at her and thought that leveling up was very unpleasant. After a while, Karen wiped her mouth and asked Haruki how long he had been an adventurer. Haruki answered that he became an adventurer this year. Karen happily shouted that she was too. Haruki replied, "That's how it is, of course." Karen asked Haruki if he had ever trained in martial arts. Haruki answered, no, when he was still a student. He only studied and worked. That's all he thought about. Haruki himself started doing it when he realized that his company was in the dark. A dark company is a company that mistreats its employees by giving them too much work and stress. Karen looked at Haruki and said that was a very strong reason, and he wasn't Haruki. Haruki closed his eyes and thought that in his opinion, that was all thanks to his equipment. He told Karen that his underground prison was always open, so she could hunt here as much as she wanted, whenever she wanted. Karen smiled and replied, "Then he will try to destroy them all." Haruki told him not to and asked him not to overdo it, but Karen rushed to the scallop battlefield. Pender dealt with some of them, so when he fell to the ground, his staff Karaboshi Haruki turned to him. Karaboshi Haruki thought so. According to his calculations, Karen had already defeated 100 centipede. She calmly dealt with them alone, but she still did it with fear of leaving her alone. Haruki thought that even though pumping up his speed was different from his speed, apparently his accelerated skill growth made him feel that way. Karen apologized to him and said they should rest. Karaboshi Haruki answered, "Yes, of course." Karen leaned against the sweaty and trembling underground prison wall. She fell to the ground without strength and closed her eyes, taking water from her backpack. Karaboshi Haruki looked at her and thought she was amazing. Karen had never complained about anything. She was brave enough and not afraid of difficult job differences. She decided to help Karen a little. She opened her characteristics panel and sat there, trembling, thinking that maybe all these shellfish traits would appear in front of her in a dream. Karaboshi Haruki observed her characteristics and opened his eyes in surprise. Thinking it was the same, Karaboshi Haruki considered that Karen had magical skills in her characteristics, so Karen knew how to use magic. Haruki looked at Karen and thought that there was still some magic yet to be fully learned, so only a little was known about her. Almost all adventurers dreamt of mastering these skills, and one of them was the owner of these skills right in front of Haruki. Now, he clenched his fists while thinking that he was very curious to know more about Karen, and he really wanted to see Karen in action. He was immediately caught by the house for the knowledge he saw in Karen, and he thought that she was hiding her skills, which meant she was trying not to use magic. Haruki thought that Karen was just like him, a beginner who often harmed others because they didn't know how to use their skills, and it was very dangerous to share information with outsiders. Haruki thought that it needed to be done gently, signaling to Karen that he called her Sam. She turned to him and Haruki said that he wanted to ask and immediately asked Karen if she had magic. After forcing the question, Karen squeezed her wand and asked Karaboshi Haruki why he was asking her about what Karaboshi Haruki was thinking. She wondered why he was asking her question, so Karen looked at him wearily. Karaboshi Haruki quickly put his hand in front of him in defense and told Karen that it seemed like her accessories were important to her. Karen looked like a witch girl with them. Karaboshi Haruki asked her if it was true. She didn't know, but she said that if someone had a magical weapon, then there must be magical abilities, right? Karaboshi Haruki continued to say that he was thinking about it because they were going together. They could talk about their skills. Karen told him that even if someone had it, she didn't think about what that person would say about it until she reached an advanced level. Karaboshi Haruki asked Karen why she thought that way. She answered because Karaboshi Haruki was dangerous. Haruki thought the same way. He knew Karen was defending herself, and he got complete information about it. Karaboshi Haruki thought about it and looked at the panel again. He wondered if there was any benefit to the skill of luck or not, but he didn't have it, which meant that maybe this skill had something to do with magic abilities. Karaboshi Haruki pressed something on the panel and thought about it. In some ways it seemed like a lottery. Karen looked at his back and wondered what he was doing, and then he started trembling. Haruki was also trembling, thinking it was an earthquake. Haruki and Karen froze, and then Haruki said it wasn't good, and they needed to get out. Karen supported his decision, and they started running towards the exit door. Haruki thought his voice sounded like something collapsing. He wondered what if it was a parade of giant scallop monsters. It seemed impossible that they could kill them if there were many of them here. The giant centipede blocked Haruki and Karen's way. He appeared after them on the 8th floor. It could easily kill them and was highly toxic to them. The centipede was not only very fast, but also had a very good sense of smell. Haruki opened his eyes in surprise to see the giant shell monster and wondered what they were doing here. They were on the ground floor and the monster immediately swept through Haruki and Karen's belongings. Haruki quickly threw himself forward, shouting at Karen to retreat. She shouted back at him to cover himself again. Karen wanted to say something but didn't have time as the monster launched an attack. Haruki screamed at Karen from behind. The giant shell monster didn't appear here often. It was a very rare species. This was a mutant that could become stronger than their boss. Haruki attacked the giant centipede on the head, but he didn't break through the monster's shell. Haruki, who was angry, thought the insect had strong armor. Karaboshi Haruki cursed as the giant centipede took advantage of his weakness, leaping onto him and attacking. Karaboshi Haruki closed his eyes as the monster opened its mouth, but then it was attacked by magic. It was Karen, using her magic to defeat the monster. They later emerged from the underground chamber, and Karen happily exclaimed, "Wow, look at that beautiful sunset." Karaboshi Haruki found himself thinking that he had never thought about it before. He noticed a structure that he and Karen had built together and saw that it said they sold and bought equipment and materials. Karaboshi Haruki said that they had really made a decision. Karen told him that when they went to the underground prison, there was no shop there. Karaboshi Haruki thought it was amazing that he usually assessed the area before opening a store, considering the number of people and their purchases, and not just opening a store in the wilderness where 2 people lived. This shop looked very strange. Karaboshi Haruki, who is strange, said it in any case, if he is happy they have been opened, they only have a few ingredients, so they will soon sell it. Karaboshi Haruki opened the store door and said, "Sorry, there is a girl behind fighting a shopkeeper named Yuduki Akane. She is in a strange condition," and said, "Welcome. They have a few items but they can please look around." Yuduki Akane looked around the empty store thinking that they didn't have anything at all. Karaboshi Haruki asked Yuduki Akane akin that he is the shopkeeper from the store in Sapporo. The girl has tears in her eyes. She holds her head in her hands and screams loudly with tears in her eyes about the reason she was sent here. Karaboshi Haruki thought about what the girl said here twice. He turned around and left, saying that they would do it again later. He thought to himself that the girl had changed since their last meeting. But Yuduki Akane stopped him again, saying that he really had to leave the girl crying alone. Karaboshi Haruki thought about how quickly a girl sat at the counter and wiped her tears, saying that she had done so many things for this company. "Isn't this discrimination against women?" she asked Karaboshi Haruki and Karen. "Isn't it cruel?" They agreed with her, "It's true." Karaboshi Haruki sat in front of her and replied, "Yes." Yuduki Akane kept saying that. Even though sales have increased, it's only because he got involved in another business. Haruki asked him if he was really Yuduki Akane, who had been demoted. He would catch him by the shoulder and ask him not to say it out loud. He replied, "Okay," and turned away from them. Haruki, his incompetent boss, asked him how he would buy materials from them. He angrily turned to Haruki and shouted that he would buy them anyway. Just because he was sent to hell doesn't mean he's like that. Haruki, who looked incompetent, stared at him and wondered why he looked like that. Yuduki Akane would hit him, put on gloves and ask what they had here. Seashells and giant crabs. Yuduki Akane counted his items and said that there were 96 domestic seashells, each worth 1,000 yen. But about the giant centipede shell, Yuduki Akane will ask Karaboshi Haruki if he is sure he wants to sell it. He asks him what Yuduki Akane means. Yuduki Akane tells him that the armor is made from the shell of a giant of centipede, which is much better than Yuduki Akane's armor because he already has the material, and it will be cheaper than buying it from scratch. Yuduki Akane says it's not him selling it. Yuduki Akane asks again why Karaboshi Haruki is doing it. Haruki answers that he almost didn't do it today. He remembers Yuduki Akane telling him that if his level is too low, the equipment won't accept him and he won't be able to use it. Haruki thinks he needs to become stronger first. Yuduki Akane tells him that then they should keep some pieces, and he will buy the rest. Haruki looks at him in surprise. Yuduki Akane answers again that there may be a time when he might need it, and he will sell everything. Haruki answers him clearly, thinking to himself that Yuduki Akane is a good person. Even though he himself didn't say it, Yuduki Akane said in the end that the 8 giant snail shells would be worth 40,000 yen, and along with the domestic snail shells, they would cost 138,000 yen. He asked his Karaboshi Haruki if everything was suitable for him, and she said yes to him. Karaboshi Haruki told the girls that they could still split everything in half. He replied well, but Karen immediately shouted wait. She shouted to Karaboshi Haruki that she should take more. She told her that she helped her kill these snails. Karen told Karaboshi Haruki that she was only able to hunt them because she would never do it alone. Karaboshi Haruki didn't know how to answer the girl. She told Karaboshi Haruki and Karen that they finally had to decide. She was debating the same thing yesterday. Karaboshi Haruki asked her if she could keep her mouth shut for a moment. She asked if they should hurry. Haruki offered Karen a choice that he would take half of it, and in return he would answer some of her questions. Karen nodded and said okay. Yuduki Akane would ask them about something they hadn't decided yet. He said the evening sun was very bright here and he couldn't stand covering the window with a wooden board. Haruki looked at her and thought that this girl seemed like that. She was bad at everything except for work. Yuduki Akane would count the amount, and then Haruki said that he still needed her to evaluate something that the girl asked for. Letter C. He put the bag in front of her. It was covered in something slimy. Karen closed her mouth and screamed. Haruki told the girl that it was a fallen lizard's stomach when they were collecting materials. Yuduki Akane would tell her the story. He talked about it so calmly, remembering how it looked at fascination when he found it, and Karen screamed in horror. Yuduki Akane checked the bag and asked Kataboshi Haruki what kind of assessment she needed, a simple or detailed one. Yuduki Akane replied simply that he would do it himself. It would take about a minute and cost 1,000 yen. A detailed assessment would be done in the laboratory using different equipment, and all of this could take about a month depending on its complexity, costing 100,000 yen. Karaboshi Haruki thought to himself, saying, 1 month, 100,000 yen. Yuduki Akane told him that it would all be done by the experts at the Mitsubishi laboratory. Karaboshi Haruki said okay. This time they would be satisfied with a simple assessment. Clearly, this was something amazing. Yuduki Akane smiled and told him that he understood. He took the object in his hand and said that it was magical and shaped from behind. He put his hand inside, and then She told Karaboshi Haruki that he congratulated him. This actually seems like a small miracle, but things bigger than 20 centimeters will fit inside it, resembling a classroom. He asked Karaboshi Haruki if she wanted to sell it. He started saying, "I'm sorry, but I don't want Yuduki Akane to interrupt." He said that he would buy the bag from her for 100 million. Karaboshi Haruki was shocked and asked him for 1 billion. Yuduki Akane asked why he was so surprised. Now the price for transporting goods is no longer done graphically. Karaboshi Haruki thought about what exactly if you invested 100 million in some companies, but he said out loud that 100 million is certainly good, but they will keep their own bags. Yuduki Akane answered that he thought it was the right decision. Then Karen entered the room where Karaboshi Haruki was standing. She looked around and said, "This is his house." Karen happily said, "Oh, a laptop." Karaboshi Haruki replied that only a few people have this computer nowadays. He has solar panels at home so he can easily use electricity. Karen was jealous of Haruki's big house and her ability to limit electricity consumption. Haruki asked about the price, and now he has risen. He invited Karen to sit at the table and thanked her. Karen looked at herself in the mirror and cried. Haruki told her that she could drink, and he took a glass and a drink. Haruki asked her if the water was good, and Karen smiled and told him that yes, the water was very good. Haruki told Karen that after this, he wouldn't do it again, and she could drink tap water. Karen told Haruki that she wanted to talk to him about something. He answered accurately and asked Karen what she meant by using magic. She told him yes and apologized for hiding it from him. Haruki told Karen that he trusted her and it was the right decision. It would be dangerous if others found out about it and they wouldn't be interested. Karen asked why it wasn't interesting. Haruki replied, "Well, adventurers find it fun because their lives are full of adventures and battles with monsters. Isn't that what Ken Haruki's story is about?" It seems like he's playing his game excessively. He told her that maybe it was true, but he believed it would be better for her to use the magic she had. There was no one else in this underground prison except for them, so Karen could safely use Haruki's magic. He informed Karen that if she continued to use magic constantly, her abilities would improve. Even if Karen found herself in a situation like today, she could easily overcome it. With that, she thought to herself that she also wanted to see it. Karen replied that she understood, and from tomorrow onwards, she would start using Haruki's magic. Haruki asked Karen if she could use the magic now. Karen apologized and said that it was difficult to use magic outside the underground prison. Haruki clearly replied, asking Karen how long she had been using magic. She said she didn't know. She continued, saying that as long as she wandered around the underground prison, she felt like everything would work out for her. And when he grabbed the staff with one hand, Haruki replied that he understood, and since then, Karen has been using this staff. She said yes, and said it was easier for her to control magic. Haruki thought about his answer, thinking about what that underground prison meant. It itself had accumulated magic in the staff. After that, Karen released it. Karen asked Haruki about Karaboshi Haruki, who only wanted her to talk about it. He answered yes, yes. Karaboshi Haruki poured water and asked Karen another question about where she would sleep tonight. She answered with a smile that she was here. Haruki was surprised by her answer and spilled water from his glass. Karen looked at him with a smile, and Karaboshi Haruki shouted loudly. What did Karaboshi Haruki say to Karen? He told her that he didn't hear. He asked Karen again where she would spend the night in it. He asked Haruki a question about how he had another room, and he answered yes. But Karen quickly said that if he did, then she would stay. Haruki immediately shouted at her, "No, no, no!" And Karen replied that everything was fine and she wouldn't be afraid even though he had a whole collection of creepy masks there. Haruki shouted that they weren't there, and he himself thought so. Karen really didn't understand that she had just become an adult girl. Haruki took off his mask and Karen saw him and thought that this was the first time she saw his face. She asked Karen if she understood where they were, and she answered that yes, they were at his house. Haruki replied yes, but not only that. This house is located next to an underground prison and suddenly monsters come out from there. They will destroy his first house, and Haruki is the only adventurer in that area. And if not him, then who will stand up to protect this village? Karen asked Karaboshi Haruki if she lived here alone, right? She said that she still had to be cautious, however, because the duty of an adventurer is to protect people. Since there are two of them here, one of them has to monitor the entrance to the basement, while the other prepares a safe place for the community in case of an emergency. That's why Karaboshi Haruki wants Karen to go to the hotel and prepare a safe place there. He lowered his head and spoke clearly. Karaboshi Haruki looked at her and smiled. He thought to himself that she was indeed well kept after all the village rumors spread so quickly. The villagers might have mistaken her for some kind of perverted person who would be hated and despised without understanding her situation. The situation Karaboshi Haruki told Karen about is okay. They have already decided everything. There is a hotel near the room that costs 5,000 yen per night, which Karen will take. She thanked him for that. After that, for the next 3 days, she and Karen hunted centipede in the underground prison, killing hundreds of centipedes every day. At the end of the day, they sold the materials. Karen quickly mastered it and can now easily handle 2 or 3 centipedes. Karen's magic power has also increased. And what about Karaboshi Haruki? He studied his statistics and thought about how his sword skills had increased without him putting any points into it. He wondered if this level was really growing on its own. He thought with surprise that it seemed possible that his skills were growing as he hunted this monster. It was very cool. Then Karen realized it was a lizard and shouted to Karaboshi Haruki that this monster was hers. She handled insects. Karaboshi Haruki approached her and said that it had already reached level 100. Karen turned to him and said she wasn't tired yet. Karaboshi Haruki told her no, it was enough for today. They needed to rest and continue tomorrow. Karen asked how he was doing. Karaboshi Haruki replied that he also needed to level up. Karen quickly apologized to Karaboshi Haruki, saying that she had only been covering for her all this time. She told Karen that she didn't need to apologize and they would take a day off tomorrow. Karen told her that she understood. She told Karaboshi Haruki that if she took a step further, she wanted to do it with him. Karaboshi Haruki interrupted her and told her to rest, because even God rests once a week. He sadly replied, "Okay." Karaboshi Haruki went into the underground prison and said that it had been a long time since he went here alone. He thought to himself that he didn't want to lose to Karen in terms of strength, which they really needed. They took a break from time to time for their moral and physical adventures. Condition is everything, including being prepared to face danger. Karaboshi Haruki passed the first floor, and besides danger being a part of it, he also didn't find anything interesting. Karaboshi Haruki wondered if he could reach the 4th floor. Then he noticed a black raccoon in front of him. It was a very fast raccoon with strong claws, originating from the black tanuki monster. The raccoon immediately opened its fangs and rushed to attack Karaboshi Haruki. He was surprised at how fast the monster raccoon was, much faster than a killer rabbit. But it turned out that it didn't matter. Karaboshi Haruki couldn't handle it. He drew his sword and fought the monster, and somehow Karaboshi Haruki managed to defeat it. He decided it was time to end this battle and make a deal with the successful black raccoon. He defeated about 100 of them, and Karaboshi Haruki leveled up 6 times, and his backpack was now full of tanuki meat. When Haruki returned home, he thought that he would make tanuki soup. Haruki said that now he would go to the 4th floor. Then Haruki walked and thought that the boss was in front of him. "This is a big black raccoon." Haruki saw the monster and thought that it didn't even need help. He could easily do it. The beast rushed to attack him, but Haruki attacked the monster and it repelled his attack. Then the raccoon hurt Haruki with its claws, but Haruki still defeated the monster that was attacking him towards the raccoon and soon realized that the underground prison was glowing. Haruki said that he understood why he read it on Wiki. It seems to mean defeating the boss. Haruki said that he was sure about it. He had to get something to defeat the boss, and then the raccoon's body disappeared. Haruki screamed that he didn't collect its materials and its body was swallowed by the underground prison, but then he noticed that it wasn't the raccoon. There was something left behind. Haruki held it in his hand and said it was a big raccoon claw, and it seemed to be made of iron. Haruki thought that maybe the remaining part of the boss was some kind of rare iron. He decided that the iron needed to be evaluated. Haruki happily said that it was time for him to go to the 4th floor, opened the panel, and didn't understand why his points hadn't increased yet.